I want to thank you, Gene, for all you've done in setting this up. I know this is a lot of work, but thank you very much. And I also want to thank the Colorado Mountain Club for letting us do this. So I hope this afternoon I'm able to show you some of the things that really have been a big interest to me here in the Colorado Springs area, the culturally modified trees. And back in 2016, I finally got the answer to my question: why are all these trees so bent and snarled when most of the trees, these pine trees, are just straight up and tall? But so I got my answer in 2016. I went with John Anderson on a little walkabout over in Fox Run Park. Fox Run just maybe a half a mile or so from the house here. And it's got a tremendous amount of trees that are bent and culturally modified. And so I have also been very pleased with my association with Dr. James Jefferson. He's a Ute elder with the Southern Ute tribe. And he's explained to me a lot of the different things about these trees. Some were spiritual, some were meant to mark trails, and some special places. But the ones that have been marking the trails, to me, have been the most interesting. And as Gene mentioned, I am a member of the NASTAP group, and that's also helped me quite a bit. So what I have tried to do with my part of the CMTs is listen to these stories, how these trees were bent, what methods were used, and I've tried to take that into the physical aspect of the tree. We'll actually be looking at a tree later on that I've dissected. So we'll see what physical forces were applied to it and how that looks in the wood. So here we go. Let's start going to the agenda. We're going to be going through a little checklist that helps me and should help you kind of go through a process of seeing if some of the characteristics of different trees might be a CMT. We're going to be looking at a lot of CMT photos, and we're going to be talking about some trails. One of them will be a local trail, the Cherokee Trail. Then we'll get into dissecting the CMT, and we'll see how this question thing works. But as Gene was saying, there's a chat box down at the very bottom. So whenever you get ready to when you have a question, type that in, and we'll see when we get to it. So here's the verification chart that I was talking about. And the way I usually use this is start on the left up at the top, rule out the natural causes, and I'll have examples of each one of these, but I'll just run through them kind of quickly. Of course, you have deer and elk, porcupine that do a lot of things to the bark on a tree. You got all kinds of weather, snowfall, wind. Lightning is one thing that can make you think it might be a CMT. Mistletoe, dwarf mistletoe, is a parasite, and it does a lot of strange things to these trees. And of course, one of the things we'll be looking for are bark peels, and a lot of the trees along the road or whatever might be scratched up by heavy equipment. So when I go through these on the left, and I pretty well ruled all of them out, then I go up the right side. One thing these trees have to be is over 100 years old. Now the Ute were put on the reservation in the 1880s, but of course they didn't all get that email, so they didn't all show up right away. Some of them actually probably stayed off the reservation. We've got historical evidence that the Ute were still here in the early 1900s. So one thing that you can kind of use to tell the age on the trees, they'll start to turn brown, kind of like the color or the picture over to the right, kind of a burnt orange color. And so that's one thing that kind of helps you. We'll be looking at some trees all through this thing. I'll point that out to you again, how that coloration is on the bark. Another thing that, like I said earlier, some of these trees might be located near a trail. They might be pointed at a water source. I've found a lot of these trees are on top of a little mound or a hill. Another thing, going up the right side, if you see some other CMTs around the area, that kind of ups the possibility that the trees that you're looking at might be a CMT. There are going to be some tie-down marks on it. I'll be referring to these as tie-down marks or ligature marks or cross-grain scarring. And also in that little picture to the right, you can see the tie-down marks in the bark. And another thing is you'll see a lot of peeled bark, maybe on some of the trees. Here is definitely a Mother Nature culturally modified tree. I sometimes call them NMT, nature modified tree. I found this tree on the way to Mount Herman, so along the trail. And as you see, this is one of the things that can happen. A tree can fall across a younger tree and bend it. And in this case, the other tree never let go. It clamped on and stayed there. A lot of times when I'm hiking along a trail, kind of on the side of a hill, a lot of trees might be bent. I kind of rule those out because there's a lot of rocks that roll down those slopes and might bend the tree and it stays in that position. Here's some dwarf mistletoe, and this is really a parasitic plant that when it gets on some ponderosa pine or gets on other trees also, it can really do some damage. It really makes the limbs twist. And this has a real interesting way of spreading itself. It's over a few years process, but it'll develop some little white berries. When these berries kind of get build up pressure, they'll explode and they'll travel as far as 50 foot or so. And of course they're sticky, so anything they stick to, the process starts again. Here's a tree that has been infested with dwarf mistletoe, and you can see it does weird things to the limbs. This is pretty extreme right here, but this gives you a good example of when you see this, there's no way that that's going to indicate it is a modified tree. Wind, snow damage. I don't know if this tree will ever straighten back up. Maybe it will, but it certainly was, I think, snow loaded in this neighborhood. Lightning. Lightning will usually go from the top all the way down to the ground. Now, lightning can be another thing that can kind of fool you when you're looking for a CMT. If it doesn't totally kill the tree, the part that it strikes might become dead, and the tree will regenerate another limb and continue to grow. But the lightning strike is one thing that will help you kind of rule that out. Now let's start looking at some helpful signs to kind of go up the right side of that chart. And as you see, here are the tie-down marks or the cross-grain scarring where this tree was tied down. Here is the color of the bark. It's kind of the burnt orange color, and it's starting to flatten out. So this tree is definitely an old tree. There's another thing. Now, these things are kind of easy. When you see this, you really are starting to zero in on a sure thing. But on this particular tree, to make this tree a little more pliable or bend it easier, say they cut the tree fibers. There's a bark peel. The bark peel starts here, goes on down below the cut. And another thing that was done to these trees was the primary leader. This was the original tree, and they girdled the bark, removed the bark from it. That will kill this part. The growth was redirected up. So when you see all this, that's another very, very good sign. And what this indicates, this primary leader, when this was done, this was the size of that tree. So it was relatively small. Here's another bark peel. These bark peels can kind of range in length from maybe 4 or 5, 6 feet. This is an indication that I lots of times really look for to know if it might be a CMT. Again, these trees won't always have a bark peel. They won't always be cut like the previous photo, but these are some helpful things to kind of get you down the road. This is a different type of bark peel. This type of bark peel, the Native Americans used in time of need for food. There's a lot of protein, a lot of minerals and things in the cambium layer underneath the bark. They would take either a sharp rock, or later on when they had attained some metal tools, they would take their hatchet and they would cut the bark. They would take a sharp stick underneath the bark, peel it away, and then the wood could also be used for a baby cradle or have some other utilitarian uses around the area. If you have ever been to the Great Sand Dunes National Park, they have a bark peel tree, a specimen inside. They have found, I think, a little over 50 trees within the park area that have these bark peels. And there have been more found around the area. So there was a lot of need in food back in a certain time. So this particular tree is in a cemetery here in the local area. So normally when you see these trees, this is another thing that you might use to rule out, because fire can also create a bark peel. It's normally kind of straight up. It goes all the way to the ground. A real bark peel does not go all the way to the ground. If you can imagine trying to peel the bark all the way there, it would be very difficult. Probably on this might have come across here. And this might have been done by fire later on, or it could have been done by porcupine or whatever. But this is a real good example of a bark peel tree. This is one thing that the Ute have said that they did do in their customs. Here is a mining claim or a bearing tree. And I found this tree, this wasn't used by the Indians, this was used by the prospectors that came later on, trying to find their golden nugget here in the Colorado Springs area. But they would put a blaze on the tree. And as you can see, here's, well, maybe you can't see, but anyway, here's a B, there's a T and A 1217770, whatever that means. That was their bearing tree marker. They would put probably 4 of these trees to mark the perimeter of their mining claim. Now this is going to be real interesting little deal here. I don't know how this will work for you guys, but I'm going to show you. This is called an arborglyph. It's kind of the opposite of a petroglyph. It's a picture in a tree. And I do not know if this is an official arborglyph, but I thought it was a very good example. I've never seen an arborglyph myself. I'm gonna point out what I see within this picture. But to me, here is the head, the chin, the eye, and the person is looking upward. Here could be the hair hanging down. Here's an arm outstretched. Here's another arm here at their side. Here's a leg, and here's the other leg. And I guess maybe in the question and answer session, I'll find out how well this picture might have turned out in your vision. But along with the bark peeled trees, an arborglyph is another thing that the Ute Nation indicates that they did do to trees. So this and the bark peel is called a culturally modified tree. This is an example or an illustration of how they did bend the trees. We'll start down here at the bottom. This type of tree is called a burial tree. So they would make a fork stick or a thong, stick under the tree, and they would tie it down. Their material that they would tie it down, it might be a yucca rope, or it could be rawhide. They'd stake it down. So this takes two forces to pull this down. And this tree and this other tree also look pretty large in this illustration. Of course, these trees would have to be pliable before they could do this. But they would pull it down. And here again is the primary leader. And the tree starts its upward growth toward the sun. This is the tree that I've really been intrigued with. This is the trail marker tree. And this is a really gold class example of what they look like. They don't all look like this, but they're normally bent at a 30-degree angle. Again, they would take a rope, some material, stake the tree down, again, when it's pliable. And here, again, is the primary leader. And this can either be facing one way or the other, however you would want to mark the trail or a water source or low water crossing or whatever you would be marking. So that's how it was done. That's how it's been explained to me that it was done. Now we're going to start into some culturally modified tree photos. This is called a burial tree. There's a broken bark pattern there. On the other end, there's the primary leader. This tree is in Fox Run Park. And in this particular area, there's another burial tree just across the way. We're going to be looking at some other trees that are right up on this hill. Now, because it's called a burial tree, does not necessarily mean there might be burials there, but it could indicate that there are burials in the area. There's another burial tree, and the people that go with me up to Bar Camp and Pikes Peak in January, February, when I lead a hike up there, they can nearly tell the story of this tree. It's right alongside Bar Trail, and normally when we're there, it's partially covered with snow. But again, you can see the broken pattern and the primary leader here. This is a very interesting tree here. I would call this a trail marker tree. It's out in eastern El Paso County. This particular tree is actually on John Anderson's second book on CMTs. This was a majestic tree. There are a lot of other trees when we went on the field trip out to this area. This is another very unique tree in Fox Run. This is called a prophecy tree. The thought is that it carries a future prophecy, unknown, but that it's going to be telling some story. Here to the right is the larger of these two trees. It appears, this is a smaller tree here, it appears this smaller tree was actually bent in to the larger tree, and you can't really make it out in this photo, but there's some kind of intergrowing going on right here in this area. We're going to be looking at another tree later on that, as I said, a lot of these trees are trail markers. They mark various things, but there's going to be a tree about 100 foot over here. You won't be able to see all this, but there is another tree about 100 foot away that was pointing right at this tree, or these two trees. This is another very interesting tree in Fox Run Park. And it's different from most of the other trees that we're going to be looking at, in that it comes up, goes back down to the ground, and we think this might be a tree that was modified by the Comanche Nation when they were in the area. I'll be looking at another tree right after this that's kind of the same shape. But later on, I want you to kind of visualize how these trees are shaped, because I'm going to be showing you the real deal. One of the Comanche marker trees that's in Texas. It's a huge oak. I've contacted the people that work with the Comanche Nation there in Texas to try to get them to come up and verify if this is a Comanche tree or not. And then boom, COVID hit. So here we are, we'll wait and see. Here's the other tree that we attribute to the Comanche. You can see the same type thing. It kind of goes very low on the ground, comes down, makes ground contact. This is a huge tree here for our ponderosa pine. Remember this look though. Here's a tree in Dawson Butte open space. And as you can see, the tree's dead. And this is a fate that I'm going to be showing you several trees in this area. This was one time my son and I were looking at this tree. We come along about a year later, and here's that same tree on the ground. Here's a tree that's called the grandmother tree in Fox Run Park. This is a good example of what the bark looks like in a very old tree. You can see it's kind of flattened out. You can see the burnt orange color compared to some of these other trees that are back here. You see the bark there, it has not flattened out. And as you can see, all these other trees around here are straight as an arrow up. This is a kind of a unique tree in that if you watch the video that was attached to this website, the sign-up page, John explained that this tree was probably split, and to do the, there are tie-down marks or cross-grain scarring marks on these limbs. To do that, the thought is that there might have been cordage used tied to a heavy rock to make these limbs bend in this shape. The grandmother tree. Here's another tree that is very unique. You can see hollow here in the inside, and it's all twisted up here. Here's my grand dog down here, Pookie, and of course my son's Boots. But later on, this tree suffered another fate. We had a strong wind, and that's what happened to it. It broke. Here's a tree that was in the pineries. This is a huge tree, as you can see. And the pineries is a new open space that's just opened up in June. I would invite you to go out and give it a try. I understand they have a 9-mile loop trail out there. Of course, this area was in the Black Forest fire, so it's got a lot of open spaces created by the fire, but I understand it's a pretty nice area. I haven't been there yet. But anyway, here's John Anderson standing behind this huge tree. And let me get my computer back in here. And this is another tree that, oh, look out. Let me find my space here. Okay. This is another tree that suffered a fate. This is that same tree a few years later. We had a big windstorm come through. Really did a lot of damage to a lot of trees. Here's another burial tree. This one's in Fox Run Park. This is an interesting thing. This is very close. This is just right up the hill from the very first burial tree picture that we saw. And this is thought to be a ceremonial site. I want to point this area right here. There's a burn right up here in this area of the tree. You can see there looks like kind of a burl right here on this tree. Over here, there's another modified tree. We're going to look at just the mirror effect, the opposite direction. So here's the tree that was far away. Here's the tree we were looking at. Here's the bulged area. Here is what appears to be a fire. This dark area here is not burnt. It's just darkened. But you can see the bark has been removed from this whole side of the tree. And I don't know, it looks like somebody just in a ceremony or whatever might have happened, that that particular tree was burnt. Here's another tree that, in doing the survey, I'm doing some survey work with the help of a friend, and this particular tree points directly to Pikes Peak. Now, Pikes Peak had a lot of symbolism to the Ute Indians, and it points right at Pikes Peak. Pikes Peak was also called Tava, the Shining Mountain. This tree, I took this photo in 2016 on my walkabout with John in Fox Run Park. This is the tree I was talking about that's pointing right at the prophecy tree. You can see it's dead, and about a year or so later, came by, and here's that tree. It's laying on the ground. Now, when a tree falls in one of the regional parks, we have a park crew that goes out and they'll cut a cookie, which is a thin slice of wood. It needs to be about thinner than 3 inches. And so it can be put under a microscope so we can perform dendrochronology, count the rings on the tree. We got a cookie from here. We got a cookie from here. An interesting thing we learned when we found this tree. Now, here again is the top side of that tree. Here is the pith, or the center core, normally in a tree. Normally it's in the center. But what we discovered with this, you can see some of the rings going down. This is about 18.5 inches from this rotted pith area down to the outside. There's 147 rings from this area down here, and there might have been maybe 20 or 30 rings lost in this area here. So the tree might have been maybe 180 years old or 170 or something like that. But in using this idea with an off-centered pith, led us to this conclusion that this is a perfect example of a trail marker tree. Ones that we looked at earlier in that illustration. When you come to core a tree, you don't have to have all dead trees or cut them down to tell their age. You can core a tree. It's a little tool that's a hand tool, and it has a kind of a bit, I'll call it a drill bit, on it that's about the size of a pencil. So it's real small, and you core the tree, extract it, count the rings, and you pretty well know the age. How this is done, it's called in the forestry area, diameter at breast height. And so what we just learned in the previous slide, this pith would probably be right up in here somewhere. So just walking up, and this might be the area where a person would walk up and perform the coring, it would be very difficult to get a correct count if you try to core this tree with the pith here, because you have to hit the pith to get a good accurate count. So this was kind of an aha moment for us. Here's another very interesting tree in Fox Run Park. How they twisted those things, I have no idea. The Ute did go to Arizona, as well as New Mexico and here in Colorado. And this is Part Sublime on the north rim of the Grand Canyon. And this is another huge tree here. I don't know what type of pine this is, but it's a really large tree. This has been very interesting for me. Excuse me, let me take a drink of water here. And it is water, it's not whiskey. I mentioned that I'm mapping some of these trees. Excuse me. I'm mapping some trees in Fox Run Park. Here's Fox Run Park over here. This tree points northwest. There are other trees that line up with it on farther out. This tree pretty well points back to the east. Now, I have no idea if this is true, but when we finish our GPS and our directional charts, we'll kind of know if it lines up with something. But to me, this is kind of a junction of a trail, kind of a turning point. You go this direction, that direction. So we'll see how all that turns out. But this leads me into what I'm really interested in, and what I've become interested in, is the trail marker trees. This trail marker is a big maple in New York State. And this is kind of the shape of a lot of these trees that are in the southeastern part of the US. Now, you can see there's 44 states where the trees are found. The only 4 so far that the Mountain Sturds, a group out of Georgia, has not found trees is North and South Dakota, Nevada, and Idaho. So these trees are all over. They're scattered around. And it's interesting, the Mountain Sturds, they actually did a lot of GPS mapping of these trees, and they put them on Google Earth. There will be at the end of the presentation, there's a website for the Mountain Sturds that you can look at. But back in the 1830s or so, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, the Creek Indians, as well as a lot of others, of course, in that time frame, they were moved to the Oklahoma reservations. And these trails go back centuries. One famous trail over there in that area is Natchez Trace Trail. About the time the Chickasaw were removed, the U.S. government came in and wanted to make that Natchez Trace a mail route. And later on, it was expanded into a real thoroughfare, a road for wagons and so forth. And now, as I understand, you can go there, and Natchez Trace Parkway still goes along a lot of those roads that were established by these Native American trails. So we're going to look at a few other trees. This is the Texas Comanche tree that I was talking about. Huge tree, huge live oak tree. And there's a flagpole. This might be, I don't know, some little Texas state area or park, or I don't know what it is. But remember the shape of the previous trees that we looked at here in Colorado, how they kind of arched and came along the ground, eventually touching. And so this is what has kind of led me to believe that those two trees might be modified by the Comanche. But again, I'm just excited about the size of that tree. Wow, how old that tree would be. It's tremendous. Here's another tree, trail marker tree. This particular one is in Tennessee. You can see it continues to have about that same shape. I have no idea what species this tree is, but it's a huge tree. Here's a tree in Missouri. And like I said, these trees are all over the southeastern part, as well as here in Colorado. We're going to talk about some other trails that are located here in Colorado. We're very lucky. We'll get into talking about this one in just a minute, but I want to mention the Ute Pass Trail. If the local people around here are familiar with Highway 24, it goes up toward Woodland Park. The El Paso County park folks say that that trail was one of the oldest migration routes used, and as old as 10,000 years. So, and later on, the Ute used that same trail to go over to South Park for grazing and hunting animals, and also to do some trading with other tribes. But we're going to look at this. This is the called the Cherokee Trail. It's outlined in green. Here's the Santa Fe Trail, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar, the lower down in the southern part here. So and up here, this trail eventually ends up in Fort Bridger, Wyoming. But we're going to kind of follow it along, goes up to Pueblo, goes on up Jimmy Camp Creek. Jimmy Camp is an area that you probably now know as Corral Bluffs. It's hopefully going to be an open space pretty soon. This is getting into the kind of the prairie area. The mountains are back over here around Manitou Springs and in this area. So Jimmy Camp was kind of a mesa, got some canyons and so forth. And so we go along, this is in the area of the Black Forest, goes up through Parker, goes through Denver, along Cherry Creek, and ends up going on through to connect into some of the trails out in California. The Cherokee Trail got its name about in 1849. Cherokee tribe folks were gold miners. They came here in 1849 and started going along this trail, heading out to, of course, do like all the other folks, wanting to find those golden nuggets in California. So hence Cherokee Trail. We're going to go from this map to a little more detailed map. This is, again, here's Jimmy Camp Creek, or Jimmy Camp. Here's Black Squirrel Creek up here. Some of you guys are familiar, folks are familiar with this area. You know that Meridian Road is a primary road out in the Black Forest area. So it goes on through here. This is also, here's the Arkansas, the Platte Divide. We're also known here as the Palmer Divide. Of course, water that falls on this side goes to the Arkansas, this side goes to the Platte. Pretty interesting. Here are some areas that I have not been to up here. They're on private property, but this also goes through Castlewood Canyon State Park along Cherry Creek. The area that the next photo I'm going to show you is right in here. This again is on private property, but we were invited out to look at the trees along this trail. Here they are. I'm actually standing down in the ditch or whatever of the Cherokee Trail, taking this picture. And these are just some of the trees, some of the many trees that are along this area. And as you can see, they're huge. And here again was the primary leader on this particular tree. And I have followed this trail along as much as I could on Meridian, and I can see other trail marker trees along there. Okay, now we're going to get into the fun part. This particular tree was on private property. There was going to be a home built here, so it was going to be cut down. So they let me come in and cut it down myself. And so I was able to study the tree in a more detailed fashion. Like I said earlier, the physical forces that are applied to these trees, I was able to look and see how it might look inside the wood. Again, here's the primary leader. We're going to look at the other side of this tree too. Here's the other side. You can see there's a lot of bark that has been removed. However, I don't know. I don't know how that occurred. Here's the primary leader. Here's the lower bend. You can see the extreme bark bent area right here. There's an upper bend. Now we're going to get into one that looks like a chalkboard with red ink. What I want to point out here that we're going to be discussing here, this tree was still alive. See the needles. Here's the cookie that I took from the base of this tree. So this cookie is going to tell us how old this tree is. And the diameter of this cookie is 10 3/4 inches. This particular tree, about 30 foot tall, with that little small diameter trunk, was 404 years old. We'll look at the cookie later on. Okay, this is just a little over 6 foot right here. Here's cookie number 3. Now this is the primary leader. So by the age of this particular cookie, we'll know about the time this modification may have started. This particular cookie was 140 years old. So you're talking about a tree that landed in a tough area to grow, soil conditions were poor, whatever. It took 140 years for that tree to get a little over 6 foot tall. This particular cookie right here is above what I'm going to call the lower bend, or this modification, and it's telling us that it was 270 years old at this point. So now we're going to move on and we'll bring this tree home. So here again, this is the lower bend or the modification. Here's cookie number 3. Here's where cookie number 2 came from. I'm going to make a cut right here to separate these two pieces of wood. Here we are, we're going to be looking at the top side of that lower bend. Now we've been talking about tie down marks, cross grain scarring. Here's cross grain scarring right across the top of this piece of wood. Here, very interesting, is a cut. This cut is pretty deep. And so these two things happening here tell me that Mother Nature didn't do this. So we're going to look at the next photo and look at the other side, the back side, and here's the cut. You see it continues way on over the side. Now we're going to slice this thing open. I put it on my bandsaw and I made a couple of cuts, as you can see, one right through the heartwood and then one right out here through the side, kind of going through that cut area. So here's what it looks like when we go inside. And you can see the shape of the heartwood really bent. We're going to go next to look at this 3B to the right and 2B. And here is the area of the cut. Now we're going to go back and we're going to look at this section in more detail, 1A. Okay, cross grain scarring that we saw in one of those earlier photos. Here's the cross grain scarring up here. I want to call your attention to this heartwood that goes right underneath that. See, it's kind of sloped, pretty extremely bent right under there. It's got a bark inclusion. So it looks like you can imagine this was your knee, and you just kind of bent your knee, folded it back, because this is an extreme bend. You can really see that. To me, the limb was just forced over, and until it started growing on its own outside the bark, there it was. Now we're going to go look at the other 3B. Here's the cut penetration on that. Oh, excuse me, let me might jump out of here again. Well, I don't know, technical difficulty. Here we go. You've been here before, you know what I'm doing. So here's 3B. Here's the cut penetration. You can see it's pretty deep. I don't know, but I'm just kind of throwing this idea out to myself and to you, that maybe this cut was made to kind of facilitate bending that limb. To me, it's feasible. I don't know. One thing I always look for, again, is dwarf mistletoe in a tree. And here you can see there's dwarf mistletoe here, there's dwarf mistletoe up here. Like I say, this was about a 30-foot tall tree, and the mistletoe was about 7 foot from the top. And this is not an advanced case of mistletoe, so there's no way that mistletoe could have created any reaction within this tree to make those things come out like that. Here's a cookie. Now, it's interesting here, what I've learned, I don't own a sandpaper shop. So there's a lot of resin in this pine. So what I have done, this particular one, I think was cut on my bandsaw, but I take my router with a carbide bit and a router groove down through here. Our dendrochronologist, Dr. Bauer, does her thing, puts this under her microscope and counts the rings. Another interesting thing right here is, here we have 4 inches. You remember there was a lot of bark that was removed from that particular tree. When the bark is gone, the tree quits growing in that direction, evidently. So from here, from the pith to here is 310 years. From the center, there's 7 inches of growth, and that's 404 years. And again, to go back to the off-center pith idea, this tree was fairly upright. So if you'd walk up to it and core it, you'd think that maybe the pith would be out in here somewhere, but you can see it's not. Now, interesting thing here, this thing started back in 1616. The Spanish started the Pueblo in Santa Fe in 1610. So this thing has seen a lot of different things going on in its slow growth period. And we'll go now to the cookie number 2 that was above the modification. Like I say, it's 270 years old. And it's kind of hard to tell when you're looking at this ruler just how wide this thing is, because I get real close with my camera, so it kind of obscures the ruler measurement. But I think this one was somewhere around 9 inches. And here is the primary leader that we talked about, cookie number 3, 140 years old. And it's about 3 1/8 of an inch thick. So from right there to here, 140 years. And you can see there are some that you can see pretty good, but then there are others that get kind of obscure. So generally speaking, this is maybe not real accurate, but the modification using this number would have started around in 1756. So that's about 20 years before we tried to say goodbye, adios to the Brits. So these trees, they're ancient. They really are. This is the first cookie that I found. And this again was on private property. This tree, it's got an interesting story. It turned out to be 360 years old. It survived a fire. You see this area of the tree was burnt. There's some fire scars that are right here. And you can see all the activity that the bugs do in these trees. So from this fire, this tree lived 110 years in addition. And so since it was dead, we don't really know exactly how old this thing was when it started its growth. Here's another tree that was on private property, and it is 9 inches. Again, the ruler kind of looks a little weird, but it was 309 years old. So you can just get in your mind that a tree doesn't have to be big to be old. It just depends on where that little seedling lands and where it grows, sunlight, the water, and all those good things that help it get big. And maybe some of you have been in the Denver Museum. I don't know what kind of tree this is. I don't know really what the diameter is, but it started in 1429. So, you know, about 40-something years or so before Columbus found this place. 502 years old, a very old tree. So these trees tell a lot of stories. I really like the way they've got this laid out in the different times here. So in closing, I want to again thank you for hanging in here and listening to this. As you've seen, there's been some of these trees that started out back in the time of the Spanish when they were trying to get their empire started, and so there's a lot of history with these, and I know a lot of you from the Colorado area probably have heard the idea that these trees are all natural. There's no man activity has taken place to bend them or do anything to them. And so I know I've read the paper, the document that the Ute have put out, and they state that as a Ute nation, they had nothing to do with bending trees. That was not in their norm. But in that same document, they do say that individual families may have done this. They may have bent trees. And so this is what I think I've been hearing from Dr. Jefferson and the late Loya or Aaron and others tell me and other people that their families, or they knew families that did this. And so we're kind of all putting this onto the Ute here in Colorado. There are other tribes. Cherokee were here. Jicara, Apache were in the southern part of the state. And also the Comanche were here. So there are other tribes that could have taken part in doing this. So I would just like to say that I wish that different parties could get together and kind of sit down and come to some kind of agreement or disagreement, whether these trees are only natural or if they've had some help from man or whatever, so we could kind of get this thing straightened out. Because to me, these trees, they're historical value, you know, and I wish we could look at them in that manner. So with that, we're going to go to this slide. This is the last slide. And here's some books that if you want to learn a little more about the trees, there's a couple of books that I'd recommend. Also, here is the Mountain Stewards website, if you want to go there and look on their website and find out some things.